Step into the dark with me. Listeners, settle in, lock your doors, and let the noise of the outside world fade away. We navigate our daily lives clinging to a fragile, invisible thread. It is the unspoken social contract, the baseline of human decency that dictates we look out for one another, or, at the very least, that we don't treat human life as something disposable. We want to believe that the strangers passing us on the street share this fundamental understanding. But every now and then you peer into the abyss of a criminal case that takes that comforting illusion, shatters it against the pavement, and leaves you staring at the jagged pieces. Tonight, we are going to examine a collection of these fractures. These are the kinds of stories that don't merely disturb your sleep. They force you to confront the terrifying reality of what human beings are capable of when no one is watching. Or, in some twisted modern nightmares, what they are capable of when everyone is watching. Our first journey takes us to the sun-baked asphalt of Central California, the summer of 2017. The air outside of Los Banos was thick and heavy, but inside a moving Buick, the atmosphere was chaotic, reckless, and entirely out of control. Behind the wheel sat 18-year-old Obidia Julie Sanchez. She was highly intoxicated, her foot heavy on the accelerator, pushing the vehicle to dangerous speeds. But her attention was not on the road and winding before her. In her hand, she balanced a smartphone, broadcasting her joyride live to her followers on social media. Sitting in the back seat, completely unbuckled, were Obidia Julie's 14-year-old sister, Jacqueline, and Jacqueline's girlfriend, Manuela. They were supposed to be on a simple road trip from Fresno to Stockton. As the Buick tore down Henry Miller Road, Obidia Julie was performing for an invisible audience. She stared into the glowing lens of her phone, laughing hysterically, singing along to the music, shouting to her viewers, and dangerously lifting her hands off the steering wheel. The vehicle was a heavy, speeding missile, and the driver was entirely consumed by the digital reflection of herself. The physics of a speeding car do not care about your social media presence. In a split second, Obidia Julie lost control. The Buick violently swerved off the asphalt. It plowed through a rusted barbed wire fence, the metal tearing at the car's body, before launching into a horrific, violent rollover. The car flipped end over end at least twice, a chaotic blender of shattered glass, crushing metal, and pure kinetic terror. When the violent motion finally ceased, the dust settled over the mangled wreck. Obidia Julie, dazed and disoriented, dragged herself to consciousness, but the back seat was entirely empty. Because they had not been wearing seatbelts, the violent centrifugal force of the rollover had ejected both 14-year-old Jacqueline and her girlfriend, Manuela, directly through the shattering rear window. This is the moment where any shred of human instinct should have taken over. The moment where panic, grief, and a desperate plea for medical salvation should have been the only priorities. But the live stream had never stopped, and neither did Obidia Julie's performance. Instead of dropping the phone to administer aid, she kept the camera rolling. As she stumbled out of the wreckage, her voice echoed out to her digital audience. "Hey everybody. If I go to fucking jail for life, you already know why," she announced. The tone bizarrely conversational given the carnage surrounding her. "My sister is fucking dying. This is the last thing I wanted to happen. Okay. Alright. I don't care though. I'ma hold it down. I love you. Rest in peace, sweetie. If you don't survive, baby, I'm so sorry." It was a chilling monologue of self-preservation and performative grief. Obidia Julie approached the broken body of her little sister. Jacqueline lay entirely motionless in the field. She had suffered a catastrophic, skull-fracturing injury. Her brain was visibly exposed to the California air. Obidia Julie aimed her camera directly down at her sister's face as her life slipped away. She broadcasted the gaping, fatal wound in horrific close-up detail for her viewers to consume. When she finally managed to dial 911, the operator was met with a chaotic, unhinged refusal to cooperate. When the dispatcher desperately pleaded for their location so they could dispatch life-saving paramedics, Obidia Julie's response was void of accountability. "I don't care where I'm at," she snapped into the receiver. When the operator begged for directions, Obd coldly replied, "I don't know. You're the government. You should know how to find me." By sheer luck, passing witnesses had witnessed the cloud of dust and dialed emergency services, guiding them to the twisted metal. But time had already run out. By the time the sirens wailed and the paramedics rushed the field, 14-year-old Jacqueline was gone. Manuela was rushed to the trauma center with severe, crushing injuries to her legs. When law enforcement approached Obd, she was a whirlwind of erratic, belligerent fury. She shoved the officers, spat venomous curses at the very people trying to secure the scene, and kicked an EMT directly in the face. She coldly referred to her deceased little sister as an effing toe tag, entirely consumed by the fear that her parents were going to kill her. She had to be physically restrained and hauled away. She was slapped with gross vehicular manslaughter while intoxicated and child endangerment. The live stream, originally viewed by only a handful of people, exploded into a viral, international nightmare. Millions eventually watched the horrifying footage. During her trial, her defense was a sickening masterclass in modern digital narcissism. She claimed she continued to stream her sister's agonizing death because she knew she had a large following, and it was the only way to crowdsource a decent burial for her family. Prosecutors saw right through the veil. This wasn't a desperate act of fundraising. It was a lethal manifestation of main character syndrome, a psychological rot where engagement metrics hold more value than the blood in your sister's veins. Ultimately, she pleaded no contest. The judge handed down a 6-year sentence. She served a mere 26 months before the state released her on parole. To the public, Obd Sanchez was the terrifying, physical embodiment of social media addiction. In later interviews, she casually referred to pulling her phone out as a reflex that entirely overrode the biological imperative to save her sibling. Her own family was shattered, but not entirely surprised. Her uncle Jose delivered a devastatingly blunt assessment. He revealed that he had warned her father years prior, when Obd was just 12, that a profound darkness was growing inside of her. "She's dead to me now," he stated to the press. "If she dies tomorrow, I don't care. She's a very bad person." The system's leniency proved fatal. Less than 30 days after her early release, Obd was behind the wheel again, leading California police on a terrifying, high-speed chase that ended in yet another violent crash. Officers pulled a loaded firearm from the wreckage. Yet, somehow, the gears of justice turned favorably for her again. By 2022, she was walking free. She immediately returned to the digital stage. The remorse was non-existent. She posted videos of herself drinking alcohol inside moving vehicles, flaunting luxury cars, and making sick, twisted jokes about her dark side. She openly mocked her sister's death on live streams and dared internet critics to drop a pin if they wanted to confront her over her lethal DUI. She sought confrontation, and eventually, the confrontation found her. In the freezing December of 2025, the cycle of violence reached its term and end. On a quiet residential street in Stockton, Obd Sanchez was gunned down in a drive-by shooting. Her body was found riddled with bullets. Authorities remained tight-lipped regarding the suspect or the motive, leaving the public to debate whether it was a random act of street violence or the inevitable, karmic conclusion of a life lived recklessly. It was a tragedy for a family that had now buried 2 daughters, but across the digital landscape she cherished so much, you would be hard-pressed to find anyone referring to the victim as an innocent soul. We pivot now, moving from the chaotic, selfish violence of a California highway to the sterile, cold, bureaucratic indifference of an international airport. Many of us hold a deep, protective instinct for the elderly in our lives. We desperately hope that when they venture out into the world alone, the strangers they encounter will treat their fragility with patience and dignity. But institutions are not people. They do not possess a conscience. Fermin Delgado Pindu was a man who had spent the vast majority of his life working the soil of Peru. Born in the spring of 1933, Fermin was universally beloved by those who knew him. He was a gentle, quiet soul, a devoted patriarch who found immense peace in fishing the coastal waters and embarking on long, wandering walks. His internal compass was legendary. No matter how far he strayed, he always found his way back home. By 2011, his daughters and granddaughters had migrated to Chile. Fermin, yearning to be close to his bloodline, packed his life and followed them, moving into a home in Peñalolén. Even as he crept through his late 70s, he fiercely protected his independence. He was sharp, highly lucid, and entirely self-sufficient. There was no dementia, no cognitive fog. In March of 2018, his daughter Lily was celebrating a milestone, her 25th wedding anniversary. Her husband had orchestrated a surprise family reunion trip back to the bustling city of Lima, Peru. When the 85-year-old Fermin caught wind of the excursion, he adamantly insisted on joining. He felt the heavy tick of the clock. He believed this might be his final opportunity to see his extended Peruvian relatives. Because it was a last-minute addition, Fermin's travel itinerary was fractured. He secured a seat alongside his daughter for the outbound flight to Lima, but for the return journey to Chile, the old man would have to navigate a completely different flight on his own. Lily was understandably fraught with anxiety. The labyrinthine chaos of international air travel was stressful for a seasoned businessman, let alone an 85-year-old traveling solo. But representatives for LATAM Airlines offered a comforting guarantee. They promised Lily that her father would not be left to his own devices. They assured her that the moment the plane touched down in Santiago, staff would escort him into a wheelchair, guide him safely through the complex customs checkpoints, retrieve his luggage, and hand-deliver him to the waiting arms of his family in the arrivals hall. Trusting the institution, Lily attached a physical credential sheet to her father's clothing, a piece of paper listing his name, his home address, and her direct phone number, hugged him tightly, and watched him walk through the departure gates in Lima. Hours later, at the Arturo Merino Benitez International Airport in Chile, several of Fermin's family members stood eagerly at arrival gate 4. Fermin's flight was scheduled to touch down at 5:30 p.m. The minutes ticked by. In our post, the steady stream of weary travelers filtered through the sliding doors, but the familiar face of the gentle old man never appeared. Because Fermin did not carry a cell phone, the family swallowed their rising panic, assuming it was a standard aviation delay. But as the first hour bled into the second, the confusion curdled into absolute dread. They approached the airport staff, desperate for an update. The response they received was a wall of cold, unyielding apathy. The staff refused to even confirm if the LATAM flight had successfully landed. They barred the family from entering the baggage claim to search. They vehemently rejected the simple request to page his name over the intercom system. They just told the frantic family to sit down and wait. With nowhere else to turn, they called Lily, who was sitting in the Lima airport waiting to board her own later flight. Lily confirmed the horrifying truth. Fermin had boarded his plane. It had departed exactly on schedule. He should be standing right in front of them. For the next 4 hours, Lily sat trapped in a pressurized metal tube thousands of feet in the air, tortured by the unknown, wondering if her father had suffered a medical emergency or simply vanished. When Lily finally landed in Santiago, the nightmare remained static. The airport staff were just as obstructive. The family abandoned protocol. They fractured into search parties, scouring every inch of the public terminal. One relative stood scanning the taxi pickup lanes for so long that aggressive security guards physically removed her from the premises for loitering. It was during this desperate hunt that they stumbled upon a chilling clue. Sitting entirely alone in a wheelchair, tucked away in a corner, was a distressed, elderly woman. She told Fermin's family that she had flown in from Colombia. She, too, had been explicitly promised airline assistance, but the staff had simply wheeled her into a corner and abandoned her for hours. A security guard had eventually approached her and delivered a brutal dose of realities. "Ma'am, stand up and leave," he had told her. "They're gonna leave you sitting here for hours. They usually do this. They leave people here and never come back." The implication froze the blood in their veins. Had the airline simply dumped an 85-year-old man in the middle of an international transit hub and walked away? Under intense, relentless pressure, the airport authorities finally cracked. They admitted that Fermin's flight had landed perfectly on time. They spun a vague narrative about a baggage delay, claiming the old man had simply grown impatient, stood up from his assigned wheelchair, and wandered off into the terminal on his own. The anonymous employee who was supposedly tasked with his care vanished into the bureaucracy, never facing public scrutiny. But the silent, unblinking eyes of the CCTV cameras told the devastating final chapters of Furman's story. The footage showed the 85-year-old man wandering aimlessly through the cavernous terminal. He had no luggage. He paused frequently, slowly turning in circles, scanning the sea of rushing strangers, looking for a familiar face. The footage tracked him as he exited the sliding glass doors into the cool night air. He approached the chaotic taxi rank. An official, registered driver offered him a ride, but Furman, perhaps confused, perhaps unwilling to be a burden, politely waved him off. Minutes later, the cameras caught him approaching an individual wearing a high-visibility neon transit vest. Furman asked the question. The worker pointed a finger off into the distance. Furman nodded and obediently began walking in the exact direction the stranger indicated. That worker never came forward to explain where he had sent the old man. The final haunting frames of footage showed Furman standing patiently in line at a dark bus stop. After a long wait, he stepped out of the queue, turned his back to the airport, and simply began to walk. The path he chose fed directly into Route 68, a massive, dangerous, high-speed highway connecting Santiago to Valparaiso. The family rushed to the police to file a missing persons report. The authorities essentially shrugged. They refused to officially validate the report for 5 agonizing days. They told the weeping family to come back only if they had definitive proof that the old man was in active danger. LATAM Airlines washed their hands of the incident. The airport management deflected all blame. The institution decided that their liability evaporated the moment Furman stood up. For days, the family hunted alone. They plastered the city with flyers, knocked on strange doors, scoured hospital trauma wards, and checked the sterile drawers of the local morgues. The sightings trickled in. A security guard, who thought he saw an old man wandering near a metro station, heading toward Mapocho. But what the family discovered during their relentless search was a hidden, terrifying epidemic. As they combed the streets, they found multiple other disoriented, elderly individuals living rough in the gutters. And the stories were identical. These fragile people had been picked up at the airport by predatory, illegal taxi drivers. The moment the drivers realized the confused elderly passengers didn't possess enough cash to cover an exorbitant fare, they simply pulled over, dragged them out of the vehicle, and dumped them on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere, leaving them to the mercy of the elements and the criminal street gangs that forced the vulnerable into begging. Furman Delgado Pindu vanished with a mere 9,000 pesos in his pocket, the equivalent of about $15. He was never seen again. Whether his heart simply gave out on the side of a dusty highway, or whether he was swallowed by the unseen, predatory underbelly of the city, his fate was sealed by the staggering, breathtaking indifference of the people paid to protect him. To this day, his family clings to a rapidly fading ember of hope. But the tragic reality remains: a beloved patriarch evaporated into the wind because the system simply didn't care enough to watch him. For our third case, we travel to the humid, manicured lawns of Florida. It was the morning of May 26, 1990. The setting was the Aero Club, a highly exclusive, eccentric neighborhood in Wellington where the driveways doubled as taxiwas, allowing wealthy residents to pull their private aircraft directly into hangars attached to their sprawling backyards. Inside one of these affluent homes, 40-year-old Marlene Warren was enjoying a lazy Saturday morning. Her husband Michael was out of town on a trip. Keeping her company was her 21-year-old son Joseph, who was laid up with a broken leg, and a handful of his friends who had stopped by to keep his spirits high. The smell of fresh coffee and eggs filled the kitchen as they chatted around the table. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, the sharp chime of the doorbell cut through the conversation. Marlene stood up, wiping her hands, assuming it was a weekend package delivery or a neighbor stopping by to check on Joe. She pulled open the heavy front door. Standing on the sunlit concrete of her front porch was a figure pulled straight from the realm of the surreal. It was a clown. The individual was completely submerged in costume. They wore a wildly bright, multicolored, oversized clown suit, bright white gloves, and a synthetic, fiery orange afro wig. Their face was painted with thick, white makeup and a garish, classic red nose. In one white-gloved hand, The clown clutched a woven basket, overflowing with beautiful red and white carnations. In the other hand, they held two helium balloons. One featured a cheerful scene of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. The second balloon bore a simple, silver inscription, "You're the greatest." For a few fleeting, confusing seconds, the scene must have felt entirely whimsical. Marlene likely assumed it was a prank, a cheerful clownogram ordered by a friend to cheer up her injured son in the living room. Marlene reached out, a soft smile spreading across her face. "How pretty," she murmured, accepting the balloons. They were the very last words she would ever speak. Without a sound, the clown raised their right hand. Clutched tightly in the white glove was a firearm. The clown pointed the barrel directly at Marlene's face and pulled the trigger, shooting her in the mouth at point-blank range. As Marlene collapsed backward onto the tile, bleeding catastrophically, the clown didn't run. They didn't panic. They simply turned on their heel and walked with a terrifying, measured calmness back down the driveway. Joe, who had watched the entire, horrific execution unfold from a nearby window, screamed and scrambled toward the door. As the clown approached a white Chrysler LeBaron convertible idling on the street, they paused. The clown slowly turned their head and locked eyes with the 21-year-old son. Joe would later describe the look to detectives. He couldn't determine the sex or the exact height of the killer beneath the baggy suit, but the eyes burned into his memory. Behind the thick white paint and the bright orange wig were a pair of dark brown, utterly soulless eyes. The clown slid into the LeBaron and drove away. Joe, hampered by his broken leg, was powerless to give chase. Marlene Warren was rushed to the emergency room, but the trauma to her brain was irreversible. 2 days later, as Joe sat weeping by her bedside promising that he would find the monster who did this, the machines were turned off. Marlene slipped away into the dark. The investigation launched immediately, and the physical evidence painted a bizarre trail. The white LeBaron was discovered abandoned in a Winn-Dixie grocery store, parking lot roughly 8 miles from the murder scene. Detectives traced the VIN number to a local rental agency called Paylist. The agency had reported the convertible stolen just days prior to the execution. When crime scene technicians dusted the interior of the abandoned car, they found microscopic gold. Clinging to the fabric of the driver's side headrest were bright orange synthetic fibers, a perfect match for a cheap clown wig. More importantly, they recovered several strands of long, dark brown human hair. Canvassing the area, detectives tracked the balloons and carnations to a local Publix supermarket. The cashier vividly remembered the transaction. The buyer was a woman with chocolate brown hair and striking dark brown eyes who had paid entirely in cash. A nearby costume shop corroborated the description, reporting that a woman matching those exact features had purchased a full clown ensemble just a few days before the doorbell rang. The physical evidence was mounting, but the motive pointed directly to the inner circle. Detectives focused their crushers on Marlene's husband, Michael Warren. Michael was the proprietor of a local enterprise called Bargain Auto Rentals. However, the couple's massive estate, valued well over $1 million, was legally held almost entirely in Marlene's name. If she perished, Michael inherited the empire. The financial motive was glaring, but the emotional motive was even darker. Marlene had lived in fear. She had explicitly confided in her children prior to her death, stating with chilling clarity, "If anything happens to me, Mike did it." When Joe tried to comfort her, insisting his stepfather wasn't capable of murder, Marlene had coldly replied, "Don't put it past him." The circumstantial links to Michael were damning. In his local newspaper advertisements, Michael heavily utilized the phrase "pay less" in massive, bold font. The branding was so ubiquitous that locals simply referred to his lot as Payless. Given that the killer clown's getaway car was stolen from the actual Payless rental agency, it was a geographic and psychological connection too bright to ignore. But Michael held a trump card, an ironclad alibi. At the exact moment the gun fired on his porch, Michael was hours away, traveling toward Miami in a vehicle full of friends who swore to his whereabouts. However, an alibi only proves you didn't pull the trigger. It doesn't prove you didn't buy the gun. Detectives uncovered a deeply disturbing conversation Michael had engaged in with a lawyer a year prior. Michael had presented a hypothetical scenario, asking what would happen to an estate if a husband murdered his wife. When the lawyer explained he would be disinherited, Michael pressed further. He asked what would happen if a friend committed the murder, and the husband couldn't be tied to the conspiracy. The lawyer confirmed that in that scenario, the husband would walk away with everything, scot-free. The police shifted their gaze to Michael's inner circle, landing squarely on a 27-year-old woman named Sheila Keene. Sheila was an employee of Michael's, working as a repo agent for his car lot. She was tall, slender, and possessed a pair of deep, dark brown eyes. Officially, she had no connection to Marlene. They had never even shared a conversation. But unofficially, the entire town knew the truth. Sheila and Michael were engaged in a heavy, passionate affair behind Marlene's back. Sheila vehemently denied the romance to the detectives, but neighbors testified they saw the pair together so frequently, they assumed they were a married couple. Despite the glaring motive and the eyewitness descriptions matching her physical profile, the DNA technology of the early 1990s simply wasn't sophisticated enough to definitively match the brown hairs found in the LeBaron to Sheila. The clown suit was never recovered. The murder weapon vanished. The case went ice cold. But the brazen audacity of the crime lived on. In 2002, 12 years after Marlene bled to death on her foyer tile, Michael Warren and Sheila Keene officially tied the knot. Sheila underwent a bizarre, almost psychological metamorphosis. She dyed her dark brown hair bright blonde. She demanded people call her Debbie, effectively shedding her old identity. The newlyweds opened a burger joint in Tennessee called the Purple Cow. The rumors of her bloody past followed her, but Sheila didn't hide from them. She reveled in them. In a display of breathtaking, sociopathic arrogance, Sheila actually showed up to her restaurant shift on Halloween fully dressed in a clown costume. Employees noted it was one of the only times they ever saw her genuinely smile. For decades, the story of the killer clown of Weddington was traded as a dark, suburban urban legend. But Joe Warren never forgot the soulless eyes. He battled severe substance abuse, struggling to drown the trauma of watching his mother murdered, until he finally fought his way to sobriety, demanding justice. In 2014, the dawn of advanced forensic genealogy changed the game. The Palm Beach County Cold Case Unit cracked the evidence boxes open. Using modern technology, they tested the strands of brown hair recovered from the driver's seat of the LeBaron. The DNA was a definitive, absolute match. It was Sheila Keene Warren. In September of 2017, 27 years after the gunshot rang out, heavily armed agents surrounded Sheila in Virginia and slapped the cuffs on her wrists. She was extradited back to Florida to face first-degree murder charges. But the justice system is a machine of compromise. In April of 2023, facing a mountain of delays and the threat of a death penalty trial, prosecutors offered a plea deal. Sheila pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. The judge handed down a 12-year sentence. But due to a complex web of time served and good behavior credits, Sheila Keene Warren walked out of the prison gates a free woman in November of 2024, having served a mere 18 months behind bars for executing an innocent woman. The most chilling aspect of the crime remains the psychological warfare of the costume itself. Why a clown? Marlene Warren loved clowns. She painted portraits of them. Her home was decorated with small clown statuettes. It was a well-known, personal joy of hers. Sheila Keene, a woman who had never met Marlene, somehow acquired this incredibly intimate detail. Did Michael tell her? Was the costume chosen to disarm the wife, ensuring she opened the door with a smile? Or was it a final, malicious act of cruelty, a mistress ensuring that her rival's final waking moment was a twisted mockery of something she loved? Michael Warren was never charged. The conspiracy remains unproven in the eyes of the law, but the question lingers in the Florida humidity, unresolved and deeply unsettling. We close tonight's episode by plunging into the suffocating, humid depths of a South Carolina summer. The year is 1985. 17-year-old Shari Faye Smith, known affectionately to everyone simply as Shari, was the quintessential girl next door. She was quiet, highly dependable, and a creature of comforting routines. It was the afternoon of May 31st. Shari had just left a lively high school pool party, driving her car back to her family's home on Lake Murray Boulevard in Lexington County. At 3:38 p.m., Shari's father, Bob, glanced out the front window of the house then. He saw his daughter's car successfully pull into the long, gravel driveway, coming to a stop directly beside the roadside mailbox. Satisfied she was home, Bob turned away to continue his afternoon, fully expecting the front door to open within seconds. 5 minutes ticked by. The house remained silent. Confused, Bob walked out the front door and down the driveway. Sherry's car was idling. The engine was humming smoothly. The driver's side door was swung wide open. The mail was scattered haphazardly across the dirt around the mailbox. Sitting undisturbed on the passenger seat was Sherry's purse, and most alarmingly, her critical diabetes medication, a lifeline she would never own with her husband, under any circumstances willingly abandon. But the 17-year-old girl had vanished into thin air. Bob and his wife, Hilda, frantically dialed the police. The agonizing, suffocating panic of a missing child descended upon the house then. For 2 days, they lived in a silent hell, and then the phone rang. The voice on the other end of the line was male. It was incredibly calm, meticulously measured, but heavily distorted, likely muffled by a rag or an electronic device over the receiver. The caller stated simply that he had kidnapped Sherry, but offered a cruel sliver of hope. He claimed she was still alive, comfortably watching television. He instructed the weeping parents to check their mail, and then the line went dead. The letter arrived. It wasn't a ransom note demanding cash. It wasn't a collage of magazine clippings. It had been written by Sherry herself, in her own distinctive, looping handwriting. The title at the top of the page froze the blood of the investigators' last will and testament. The killer had forced a terrified teenager to sit down and pen her own final goodbye to the world. But despite the coercion, the words were undeniably Sherry's. It was a heartbreaking, agonizingly brave document filled with pure expressions of love for her family, a plea for them not to despair, and a final, haunting request that they hold a closed casket funeral. The phone calls did not stop. The killer had locked his jaws into the psychology of the Smith family, and he refused to let go. "Do you believe me now?" The distorted voice taunted over the line. "Well, I'm not really sure I believe you," the desperate mother pleaded, "because I haven't heard any word from Sherry, and I need to know that Sherry is well." "You'll know in 2 or 3 days," the voice replied. "Why 2 or 3 days?" "Call the search off." Over the next agonizing week, the phantom caller tormented the family. He spoke in cryptic, quasi-religious riddles, heavily implying that Sherry was still drawing breath. He would read lines from her last will over the phone, savoring the power he held. "Became one soul," the voice whispered into the receiver during a 4-0 call, brushing aside the mother's desperate pleas for her daughter's life with a chilling sign-off. "Lovin' miss you. Get good rest tonight. Goodbye." He was a predator feeding on raw anguish, operating under the delusion that he was a god deciding the fate of mortals. 6 days after snatching the teenager from her driveway, the game changed. He called one final time, abandoning the riddles for terrifyingly precise coordinates. "Take Highway 378 west to Traffic Circle," the voice commanded. "Take Prosperity exit. Go 1.5 miles. Turn right at sign Moose Lodge No. 103. Go a 1/4 mile. Turn left at White Frame Building. Go to backyard. 6 feet beyond. We're waiting. God chose us." The coordinates lead the tactical teams directly into a dense, overgrown wooded area in Saluda County. There, hidden in the brush, they found the lifeless body of Sherry Faye Smith. Forensics determined she had been murdered a mere 12 hours after her abduction. The investigators knew they were dealing with a malignant narcissist who desperately craved the spotlight. They laid a psychological trap. They organized a massive, highly publicized outdoor memorial service for Sherry. Mourners were encouraged to leave flowers, teddy bears, and handwritten letters at the site. The detectives hid in the shadows, absolutely certain that a killer this arrogant wouldn't be able to resist returning to the scene to claim a sick memento of his handiwork. He never showed. But the torment continued. The killer pivoted his obsession. He began relentlessly calling the house, specifically demanding to speak with Sherry's sister, Dawn. The calls were obsessive, graphic, and designed to inflict maximum psychological torture. He described to Dawn exactly how her sister had died. He boasted that he had allowed the 17-year-old to choose her own method of execution. He painted a horrific picture of wrapping thick silver duct tape round and round her entire head until her oxygen supply was completely severed. He then began to whisper that Dawn was next. The physical resemblance between the two sisters was striking. Investigators theorized the monster had actually intended to kidnap Dawn on that fateful afternoon and snatch Sherry by mistake. But Dawn Smith was made of iron. Unflinching in the face of the man who suffocated her sister, she answered every single call. She kept him talking, listening to his madness, praying he would let a detail slip. And finally, the monster's ego tripped him up. He grew lazy. He stopped using the device to distort his voice. And during one particularly chilling conversation, he confidently asked Dawn, "Have you heard about Deborah May Helmick, the 10-year-old? Am I speaking?" Richland County. On June 14th, exactly 2 weeks after Sherry was taken, a 9-year-old girl named Deborah was snatched from her front yard in nearby Richland County. A silver car had violently accelerated toward the playing child. A man had dragged her into the cab and sped off into the afternoon. 8 days later, the caller contacted the Smith family again, providing the exact coordinates to find the little girl's body, cementing the terrifying reality that a serial killer was operating in the county. But the ultimate downfall of the killer did not come from his voice. It came from the very document he used to torture the family, Sherry's last will and testament. Forensic experts brought the handwritten letter into a sterile laboratory. They utilized a piece of technology known as an electrostatic detection device. This machine applies an electrical charge and toner to paper, revealing the invisible, microscopic indentations left behind by a pen pressing down on the sheet above it on a notepad. As the toner swept across Sherry's final goodbye, faint, ghostly lines began to appear. It wasn't a confession. It was a mundane list. Someone had used the notepad to jot down a series of names and phone numbers. One phone number, no missing a single digit, stood out. Detectives manually dialed every possible numerical combination until, finally, the line connected. A young man answered. When detectives pressed him about any ties to South Carolina, he provided the names of his parents, Ellis and Sharon Shepard, a couple whose primary residence sat a mere 15 miles from the Smith family driveway. The police tracked down the Shepards. The couple confirmed they had been away on a long vacation during the exact window of Sherry's abduction. The detectives pressed play on the recording of the undistorted voice from the phone calls. The Shepards gasped. The identification was immediate and absolute. The voice belonged to the man they had hired to house at their property while they were out of town. A 35-year-old local with a deeply troubling history of harassment and indecent exposure. His name was Larry Gene Bell. The Shepards recounted how, upon their return, Bell had seemed highly agitated, vibrating with a manic energy, intensely fixated on the news of the missing local teenager. Ellis Shepard looked at the electrostatic printout of the phone numbers and confirmed that it was the emergency contact list he had personally written out and left on the kitchen counter for Bell. The pieces slammed together with terrifying clarity. Bell hadn't taken Sherry to a dark basement or an abandoned warehouse. He had dragged the terrified teenager into the comfortable, suburban home of his employers, using their sanctuary as his personal torture chamber, confident that the police would never think to search a respectable family's house. On June 27th, 28 days after Bob Smith watched his daughter pull into the driveway, heavily armed tactical units kicked down the door and dragged Larry Gene Bell out in handcuffs. His trial was a circus of the absurd. Bell screamed at the judge, spouted religious nonsense, and desperately tried to paint himself as legally insane. The jury saw right through the theatrical madness. It took them less than an hour of deliberation to sentence him to death. A year later, the hammer fell again for the murder of little Deborah May Helmick. On October 4th, 1996, Larry Gene Bell was strapped into the heavy oak of the electric chair. When asked for his final words, the man who had spent hours tormenting families over the phone finally had nothing to say. The silence he left behind is the only justice a monster like that deserves. Thank you for listening. Keep your porch lights on, stay vigilant, and remember that sometimes the most dangerous things in the dark are the people trying to pull you into it. Good night, love, when everyone is watching. But before we step into the abyss, we need to talk about the doors you leave unlocked every single day. Imagine, if you will, a dossier, a thick, multi-page document sitting on a desk in a dark room. This document contains the exact coordinates of your past addresses. It contains the names of your loved ones, your private phone numbers, your estimated income, and intimate fragments of your life that you have no memory of ever sharing. This isn't the work of a stalker lurking in your bushes. This is the highly lucrative, perfectly legal work of data brokers. These faceless corporations harvest your digital footprint, package your identity, and auction it off to the highest bidder. They do not care who is buying your life. You can search your own name right now and watch as your privacy is advertised like a cheap commodity on a supermarket shelf. The entire industry operates on one arrogant, terrifying assumption: that you are too overwhelmed to stop them. They know regulation crawls while the internet spreads. It feels like a trap. We are handed a false ultimatum: either completely vanish from the modern world, or accept that your personal safety is the price of using a smartphone. We begin our descent by looking at the allure of virtual worlds. For many of us, there is a distinct, nostalgic comfort in digital escapism. The pixelated landscapes of early online role-playing games offered a shared sanctuary for thousands of lonely strangers. In those worlds, the rules are absolute. The path to success is clear. You climb the ranks, you reap the rewards, and you belong to a community. But recently, the digital landscape revealed a terrifying anomaly: a virtual world that was not coded by ambitious game developers or funded by a massive entertainment studio. It was a digital ghost town, meticulously constructed by the surviving remnants of a fanatic, doomsday UFO cult, a group the world assumed had been extinguished by time and tragedy decades ago. Welcome to the disturbing, labyrinthine rabbit hole of Sidrella. To understand the digital ghost, we must first examine the physical monster. The year was 1966. The space race was dominating the global consciousness. Humanity was looking up at the stars with a desperate, romantic yearning. Paris, France, was swept up in the cultural phenomenon of extraterrestrial curiosity. Science fiction was king, and the newspapers were littered with reported saucer sightings. And wherever there is vulnerable curiosity, a predator will inevitably emerge to monetize it. A man named Jean-Paul Appel-Gay founded a group called Is-Eris. Appel-Gay was a charismatic charlatan who proclaimed himself the Grand Master. His origin story was a classic. Cepheid Rift. He claimed that during his youth, a blinding beam of cosmic light had pierced his skull, fundamentally altering his brain chemistry. From that moment forward, he alleged he was in direct, telepathic communication with highly advanced alien beings. These extraterrestrials had supposedly burdened him with a divine mission to shepherd humanity through an impending spiritual evolution. If you attempt to read Appel-Gay's philosophy, your mind will quickly start to bleed. It is a dense, impenetrable soup of pseudo-intellectual technobabble. He spoke of initiatic keys and inner vibrational orders. But stripped of the cosmic jargon, his core message was insidious. He claimed he was rescuing lost souls from the dark sewers of the collective unconscious, elevating their minds so they could join a supreme, intergalactic race. A race he chillingly referred to as the Cosmic Aryans. Whenever a charismatic leader begins invoking Aryan terminology, the foundation for disaster is poured. The original group formally dissolved in 1978, but the ideology simply mutated. It sprouted new heads under names like Galactius Futura, and eventually, Sidrella, a name rooted in the word Sidril, meaning of the stars. In these early, formative years, Appel-Gay hunted for prey on college campuses and inside quiet, organic health food shops and esoteric bookstores. He didn't approach the strong. He targeted the isolated. He sought out individuals carrying the heavy baggage of broken homes and profound loneliness. Once he had their ear, the indoctrination began. He convinced these fragile recruits to abandon their lives, don flowing robes, clutch healing crystals, and move into secluded, communal living spaces. The path to enlightenment, of course, required purchasing his endless volumes of literature and expensive spiritual courses. By 1982, the Grandmaster's grip was absolute. He orchestrated a massive exodus, moving approximately 200 of his most devoted followers across the globe to the tropical isolation of Tahiti in French Polynesia. They were building a utopian paradise beneath the sun. They spent their days meditating on the beaches, absorbing apple gurus endless, droning lectures, and watching the movie Star Wars on a loop. To Cinderella, George Lucas was not a filmmaker. He was a prophet who had been contacted by the aliens to document true, historical galactic events. But behind the tropical facade, Tahiti was a psychological prison. Thousands of miles away from their families, the followers were completely cut off from objective reality. In this fabricated vacuum, Applegate tightened the screws. He subjected them to intense, alternating cycles of psychological love bombing and severe deprivation. He dictated what they could eat, restricting their caloric intake. He deprived them of sleep, keeping them awake for agonizing stretches of time. He even forced them to communicate in a bizarre, childish coded language, severing their connection to normal human thought. Under the crushing weight of exhaustion and malnutrition, the followers began to hallucinate. They claimed to see glowing extraterrestrial entities walking among them. Ex-members would later confess that the guru hadn't unlocked their minds. He had simply ground their psychological defenses into a fine dust. And then the darkness deepened. According to the harrowing testimony of a former member named Isabelle Sebagay, who was pulled into the cult's orbit when she was merely 17 years old, Applegate weaponized the group's spirituality for his own perverse gratification. To purge the darkness from their souls, female members were forced to participate in a ritual the Grand Master dubbed Tantric Transmutation. This sickening ceremony required the women to undress, form a circle around Applegate, and engage in group sexual relations with him. Only the women he personally selected were subjected to this horrific cleansing. While outside observers correctly identified Applegate as a predatory narcissist exploiting the broken for sex and money, the believers inside the tropical compound were blinded by faith, and that faith was soon weaponized by a terrifying prophecy. Applegate announced that his telepathic alien contacts had delivered a grim ultimatum. The apocalypse was imminent. The Earth was destined for destruction. Only those who had achieved the highest echelon of cosmic consciousness would be rescued by a fleet of flying saucers and transported to the safety of Alpha Centauri. This doomsday gospel was codified in a 1982 comic book titled Timeless Voyage, written by Applegate and illustrated by a cult member named Sergio Macedo. To the outside world, it was an obscure piece of French science fiction. To Cinderella, it was the Holy Bible. It sold 30,000 copies in France. It even briefly snared the legendary illustrator Mobius, who moved his family to Tahiti to join the sect before ultimately fleeing a year later, disgusted by the leader's tyrannical abuse. But the ink of Timeless Voyage bled far beyond the borders of Tahiti. The comic book found its way into the hands of an entirely different, infinitely more dangerous cult, the Order of the Solar Temple, or OTS. Led by Luc Chouaray and Joseph D. Amambro, the OTS was a wealthy, prolific Neo-Templar doomsday cult operating across France, Switzerland, and Canada. They, too, harbored a deep obsession with transcending the physical realm before the Earth's impending annihilation. When the leadership of OTS read Applegate's comic, they did not see a story. They saw a tactical blueprint. But the OTS interpreted the ascension differently. They believed that the only way to board the alien vessels and reach the stars was to violently forcefully eject their souls from their mortal bodies. In the autumn of 1994, the cosmic delusion mutated into a bloodbath. The OTS leadership categorized their members into three distinct groups: the awakened who possessed the strength to end their own lives, the immortals who required physical assistance to die, and the traitors, those who questioned the madness. Two of these so-called traitors were Antonio and Susan Toit, a married couple who had dared to break away from the OTS. On the terrifying night of September 30th, a hit squad of cultists ambushed the couple in their chalet. The fanatics did not just murder the husband and wife. They turned their blades on the couple's 3-month-old infant, ritualistically stabbing the baby with knives and a wooden stake. The assassins then set the chalet ablaze, burning themselves alive in the purifying fire. Days later, the horror spread to Switzerland. Across to separate locations in COI and Salvan, 53 people were slaughtered. Some were willing participants, injecting themselves with lethal poisons, fully believing they were moments away from waking up on a spaceship. But forensics painted a much darker picture for many of the others. Evidence proved that several victims had fought desperately for their lives before being overpowered, sedated, and shot in the head. The compounds were set on fire. When the smoke cleared, authorities found the charred bodies dressed in ceremonial robes, meticulously arranged in star-shaped geometric formations on the floor. Including the Dutort family, 53 lives were extinguished. The cult leaders had reportedly aimed for exactly 54 deaths, a sick homage to the 54 Templar knights burned at the stake in the year 1310. As the ashes cooled, the philosophical link between the horrific OTS massacres and Applegare's timeless voyage became glaringly apparent. Applegare immediately went into damage control, aggressively distancing himself from the Solar Temple, claiming he had absolutely no direct ties to their leadership. While that may have been technically true, the cultural damage was catastrophic. Panic regarding New Age cults swept through Europe. Survivors of Cinderella began stepping out of the shadows, bravely detailing the psychological torture and sexual abuse they had endured. French authorities officially branded Cinderella a dangerous, predatory sect. Applegare, feeling the heat, executed a masterful sleight of hand. Rella seemingly evaporated. They rebranded as Azure Wellness. They retreated to Europe, purchasing a massive, secluded chateau, operating under the thin guise of a boutique hotel and restaurant. In reality, investigators strongly suspected it was simply a fortified commune for the remaining loyalists. The Grand Master lived lavishly, allegedly purchasing a fleet of pleasure yachts using the drained bank accounts of his followers. By 1999, the group officially notified the French government that they had ceased all operations. On paper, the cult was dead. But ideologies rarely die. They simply migrate to new host bodies. And Cinderella migrated into the wires. In 2001, the remnants of the cult launched a sprawling, text-heavy website. Thanks to the digital preservation of the Wayback Machine, we can peer back into their early digital defenses. The landing page was a staggering manifesto of victimhood, likely penned by Applegare himself. He compared his public scrutiny to the brutal torture of the Cathars and the Templars during the Inquisition. He went about media lynchings and blamed his detractors as people who simply had a habit of failing. If you dug deep enough into the digital architecture of these sites, past the pseudoscience articles on reptilians and water-powered cars, you would inevitably stumble into the modern incarnation of the cult. A network of active sites, complete with AI-generated artwork, video testimonials, and an online merchandise store. But the true heart of the modern cult beats inside a platform, called Club Qualitative Life. This is the internal land. It is a fully functional, three-dimensional virtual world that has been quietly operating since 2011. It is, for all intents and purposes, a cult-controlled version of Second Life. If you create an anonymous account and log into this bizarre digital ecosystem, you are met with graphics that look entirely obsolete, a relic of early 2000s software. But make no mistake, the servers are alive. You can wander through the communication point, a sterile, empty digital plaza designed for open mic indoctrination. You can visit the virtual yacht club, populated entirely by lifeless, non-player characters standing frozen on a digital dance floor. But if you load into the Unitary Science Institute, the isolation is shattered. A disembodied, pre-recorded voice suddenly booms through your headset, a French voice, imparting convoluted cosmic wisdom on an endless loop. It is almost certainly the digitized echo of Jean-Paul Applegare himself, speaking from the void. The Virtual Institute boasts a schedule of actual, real-world and virtual workshops. There are digital photo galleries showcasing massive groups of human beings, sitting in circles around physical crystals, still adhering to the dogma. But the most chilling location in the internal land is the Crystal Temple. If you walk your avatar into this digital sanctuary on a random Tuesday afternoon, you will likely not be alone. You will find other avatars sitting in perfectly silent, digital meditation. These are not bots. These are living, breathing human beings from Canada, France, Germany, and Argentina, tethered to their keyboards, communing in a cult-controlled server. When a curious investigator recently logged into the temple, an avatar immediately approached them. The digital stranger eagerly asked to move the conversation to Telegram, a highly encrypted messaging app. Once hidden behind encryption, the stranger confessed. They admitted they had followed Applegare for years. They had met the guru in the physical world. They confirmed that the Grand Master was indeed the architect of this virtual universe, praising it as a sanctuary for making special friendships. The stranger spouted the familiar, intoxicating rhetoric of the cult. We are only seeing 1% of reality. We hold the stars inside ourselves. We are destined to return to the cosmos. They warmly invited the investigator to join the evolutionary path. But the warmth was conditional. After logging in a few more times, the digital atmosphere turned hostile. The cult had noticed the outsider. A high-ranking user, operating under the name Sissy Austria, confronted the investigator. She demanded identity verification. When the investigator remained anonymous, the digital door slammed shut. The avatars remained in the crystal temple, meditating in silence, but they refused to speak another word. Driller did not die. It merely shed its physical commune and uploaded its consciousness into a virtual temple. To this day, Jean-Paul Applegearwise still commands a flock of devoted souls, their avatar sitting silently in a pixelated room, waiting for a flying saucer that will never arrive. We leave the quiet, digital isolation of the crystal temple and crash violently into the loud, chaotic reality of the modern streaming era. The internet has birthed a terrifying new breed of celebrity. We have cultivated an environment where attention is the ultimate currency, and for some, the pursuit of that currency completely overwrites their basic human empathy. This brings us to a 17-year-old boy from New Jersey named Vincent Battalora. To the casual observer, Vincent was just another face in the endless sea of aspiring content creators. He operated a YouTube channel under the moniker VinnyBet118. His digital footprint was entirely mundane. Hours upon hours of live-streamed gameplay, featuring titles like Madden, MLB The Show, and Grand Theft Auto. When he did bother to engage directly with his small audience, Vincent carefully curated a specific persona. He painted himself as a polite, respectable kid raised in a good, upstanding suburban family. But that carefully constructed facade violently shattered on the evening of September 30th, 2025. On that night, Vincent booted up his streaming software and went live. But the audience waiting for him in the chat was massive, and they were boiling over with absolute, venomous hostility. Because less than 24 hours prior, the asphalt of a neighboring town had been stained with blood, and the internet had already connected the dots directly to Vincent's front door. Let us rewind to the previous afternoon, September 29th. The time was just approaching 5:30 p.m. The setting was Burnside Avenue, a deeply quiet, tree-lined residential street in the town of Cranford, New Jersey. The air was calm. To 17-year-old girls, Maria Niots and Isabella Saws were enjoying the late afternoon, riding together on an electric bicycle. They were on a simple, innocent errand to pick up Babette. The tranquility of the neighborhood was obliterated by the roar of a combustion engine. A black Jeep Compass suddenly tore down the residential street, in a zone strictly marked for 25 miles per hour. The heavy SUV was redlining at a staggering 70 miles per hour. The Jeep did not swerve. It did not brake. It accelerated with terrifying, lethal purpose directly into the back of the electric bicycle. The impact was catastrophic. The sickening crunch of metal against metal echoed through the neighborhood. The kinetic force of the 2-ton vehicle hitting the girls at highway speeds was absolutely devastating. One of the teenagers was launched nearly 100 feet through the air from the point of impact. According to horrified eyewitnesses, the driver of the Jeep had not made a tragic mistake. He had parked down the street, quietly idling in the shadows, watching Maria and Isabella from a distance. He waited for the perfect moment before dropping his foot on the accelerator and turning his vehicle into a weapon. Following the impact, the driver desperately tried to flee the carnage. He mashed the gas pedal, trying to force the mangled Jeep away from the scene. But the shattered remains of the electric bicycle had become hopelessly wedged deep inside the engine block, grinding the vehicle to a halt. Forced to abandon the weapon, the driver kicked his door open and fled on foot. A nearby home security camera captured the chilling aftermath. The footage showed the suspect, a young male, not sprinting in a blind panic, but casually sauntering away from the massacre, his hands swinging by his sides as if he had just finished a pleasant afternoon stroll. First responders swarmed Burnside Avenue, their sirens wailing in vain. Both Maria and Isabella were pronounced dead upon arrival at the local trauma centers. The police ran the plates on the smoking, abandoned Jeep Compass. The registration fed back to a familiar address, the Battle Oro household. When the news reached Maria's devastated family, there was no mystery to solve. They knew exactly who was behind the wheel. Vincent Battle Oro had been subjecting Maria to a relentless, terrifying campaign of psychological torture for months. It remains murky whether the two teenagers had ever been romantically involved, but they shared the same high school hallways, and the animosity was a known, toxic entity. Vincent had bombarded Maria's phone with vile, vitriolic text messages. He aggressively threatened to leak intimate photographs of her to the entire school. The harassment had recently reached a fever pitch. Vincent had allegedly sent Maria highly illegal, explicit materials, prompting her to report him to the school administration. Vincent was slapped with a suspension. Terrified for her safety, Maria filed for, and was granted, a legal restraining order against him. But a piece of paper does not stop a predator. It only enraged him. Vincent escalated his war. He weaponized the local police force, calling in multiple false, anonymous reports that resulted in heavily armed officers raiding Mary's family home on at least two separate occasions. Neighbors reported seeing Vincent physically stalking her through town, his vehicle parked ominously outside her bedroom window in the dead of night. The warning signs were not hidden. They were broadcast live to the world. In the months leading up to the double homicide, Vincent had transformed his Viniback gaming channel into a dark, digital confessional, proudly identifying himself as an admirer of toxic, misogynistic internet personalities like Andrew Tate. Vincent would routinely pause his video games to rant into his microphone. He seethed with anger, branding Maria as a radical leftist, and openly, publicly swearing that he would enact his vengeance upon her. He confessed to his viewers that he suffered from blinding, uncontrollable fits of rage. This was a terrifying reality his own father knew all too well. Mr. Battle Oro, a retired police officer, had desperately called his former colleagues on multiple occasions, begging them to intervene as his son's behavior spiraled into violent psychosis. Just for weeks before the crash, Vincent had allegedly attacked his own father, spraying him directly in the face with chemical mace before stealing his car. Despite the restraining order, the stalking, the false police raids, the recorded death threats, and the frantic pleas of a retired cop, the system did absolutely nothing. They waited until two teenage girls' were dead on the asphalt. At 6:10 p.m., less than an hour after the murder, investigators brought Vincent in for questioning. But the local police were inexplicably treating the targeted 70-mile-per-hour impact as a possible accident. After a brief interrogation, they let him go. They allowed a double murder suspect to walk out the front doors of the precinct pending further investigation. This baffling, immediate release sent shockwaves of fury through the local community. Whispers of systemic corruption ignited immediately. Vincent's father was a retired officer. More disturbingly, his uncle was the active police chief of a neighboring jurisdiction. The town demanded to know if strings had been pulled to let a killer walk free. The absolute moment Vincent returned to his father's home, he grabbed his phone. He typed out a hollow, performative post offering his condolences to the families of Maria and Isabella. And then, bathed in the glow of his monitor, he booted up his streaming software and went live on YouTube to play a co-op video game. He wanted to play video games while the blood of his victims was still drying on the street. But the internet had already mobilized. Local community pages and Reddit threads had pinpointed his live stream, directing thousands of furious, grieving people into his chat room to confront the monster in real time. The chat box scrolling down the side of Vincent's screen was a blur of absolute rage. "You killed my best friend, you animal," one user typed. "Rip Isabel and Maria, you monster. I'm coming for your head, boy. He's milking views, killer." Vincent sat in his gaming chair, staring at a wall of text accusing him of double homicide, and his reaction was a chilling display of absolute, sociopathic detachment. "I don't need negativity in the stream." Vincent whined into his microphone, his voice dripping with annoyance as he began banning users. "So everybody's getting timed out. Why are we running people over? Everybody's messaging negativity. It's ridiculous." And then he articulated the dark, beating heart of the modern attention economy. He looked into his webcam and told the furious mob exactly why he was letting them scream at him. "Let me explain something real quick before I get the stream going," Vincent said, his voice devoid of a single ounce of human empathy. "The more you guys engage in the chat, the more you give me engagement, and I get paid for YouTube bum. That's fine. You're just giving me engagement." He was monetizing the outrage over his own murders. He was watching the names of the girls he had just crushed with a 2-ton vehicle scroll past his face, and all he saw were dollar signs. As the stream continued, the pressure mounted. Vincent finally disabled the chat function, silencing the mob. He stared into the lens and delivered a measured, highly calculated statement. He alluded to misinformation spreading online. He attempted to cast himself as the true victim of the narrative. "I am not authorized to talk about the whole thing," he stated, his tone carefully controlled to avoid self-incrimination. "I wish my sincerest condolences to those 2 girls lost in that tragic accident. It is an absolute unfortunate situation, and there's more to the story that you're not getting. But when the time comes, I will explain it in greater detail." There was no crack in his voice. There was no tear in his eye. There was only the cold calculation of a predator trying to manage his public relations. The broadcast finally ended abruptly when a user managed to bypass his filters and do XXX his physical address directly into the stream. The charade could not last. The public pressure was a tidal wave. The very next day, October 1st, 2025, the authorities finally moved. Heavily armed officers arrested Vincent Battle Oro and officially charged him with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The prosecutors pulled no punches. They formally alleged that Vincent had meticulously planned and intentionally executed the murder of Maria Niotes. As for Isabella Salas, the prosecutors stated that Vincent simply viewed the innocent girl as an acceptable collateral loss in his quest for vengeance. The state immediately pushed to try the 17-year-old as a full adult, arguing that Vincent had purposefully rushed to commit the murders just days prior to his 18th birthday, calculating that the juvenile justice system would afford him a lighter sentence. His YouTube channel, the altar upon which he worshipped his own ego, was permanently terminated. If convicted as an adult, the boy who smiled at his chat will face 30 years to life in a concrete cell, where there are no cameras, and there is absolutely no engagement. For our final descent into the digital shadows, we travel across the globe to the sprawling, hyper-connected social media landscape of China. In the digital era, the avatar you present to the world is a mask. It is a carefully curated illusion designed to hide your flaws, project your desires, or, in the darkest of cases, conceal your fangs. In July of 2025, a specific, highly uncanny face went absolutely viral across every major Chinese social network. The face featured deathly pale, heavily filtered skin, and impossibly bright, painted red lips. To the millions laughing at the memes, it was just a buzz or internet oddity. But to an unlucky, undetermined number of men, this face belonged to Sister Home. And Sister Home was the architect of a psychological and financial meat grinder that systematically destroyed hundreds of lives. The physical reality of Sister Home's operation was bleak. Over the span of several years, a parade of young men had navigated their way to a dingy, subterranean, windowless apartment hidden beneath the bustling streets. These men arrived carrying humble, desperate offerings of affection. They brought heavy watermelons, packs of tissue paper, and half-empty jugs of peanut oil. They were men seeking intimacy, connection, or a brief escape from the crushing loneliness of modern life. They would sit in the dim, claustrophobic apartment, chatting softly with Sister Hong. Eventually, the guest would be directed to a small bathroom to wash up. When the man emerged, vulnerable and expecting intimacy, Sister Hong would lead him toward the mattress. If a guest felt a flicker of modesty and reached out to click off the harsh overhead lights, Sister Hong would firmly stop them. The room, she insisted, must remain perfectly, brightly illuminated. Sister Hong never fully disrobed. She maintained the illusion by wearing a long, flowing, incredibly loose skirt. She would position herself over the visitor, dictating the physical boundaries of the encounter. If a man, confused by the strange physical mechanics of the interaction, dared to voice that something felt inherently wrong, Sister Hong had a pre-packaged, sympathetic excuse. She would whisper that she was suffering from a painful medical condition, claiming she was severely swollen to deter any further physical investigation. It was a lie built on top of a lie, because Sister Home did not exist. Behind the pale makeup filters and the flowing skirts was a 38-year-old biological male, known to the authorities only by his surname, Xiao. To be absolutely clear, official police reports indicate that Xiao did not identify as a transgender woman in his daily life. The persona of Sister Home was a purely predatory construct. It was a digital bear trap, meticulously designed to lure vulnerable men into his windowless basement. Xiao's methodology was a masterclass in catfishing. He would apply heavy digital modification to photographs of himself, utilizing aggressive beauty filters on surgical face masks to convincingly present as a distressed, melancholic housewife trapped in a loveless marriage. He seeded these profiles across multiple dating applications, casting a wide net into the lonely digital sea. Once he had a target on the hook, he would play the victim, building a false emotional rapport. Then he would drop the bait, a rare, secret invitation to visit his apartment for a completely free, no strings attached intimate encounter. For hundreds of men, the offer was simply too good to refuse. What makes the psychology of this trap so fascinating to the Chinese media is the demographic of the victims. Many of the men who walked down those basement steps were young, highly attractive, and physically fit. Men the local tabloids crudely referred to as little fresh meat. These were individuals who possessed the social capital to easily find genuine, reciprocal relationships online. Yet, they chose to accept the invitation of the mysterious, tragic housewife. The cultural context adds a layer of complex tragedy. In China, homosexuality remains significantly less socially accepted and openly discussed than in many Western nations. As the scandal unfolded, fierce online debates raged regarding the true nature of the encounters. Did the men truly believe they were meeting a woman? Or, constrained by societal pressures, did some of these men secretly recognize Xiaoist Ru gender upon arrival, silently accepting the bizarre role of play as an unspoken compromise for forbidden intimacy? Regardless of what the men believed they were participating in, they were all entirely oblivious to the ultimate betrayal. Buried in the shadows of the brightly lit bedroom, the unblinking lens of a hidden camera was recording every single second of their vulnerability. Xiao was not running a Lonely Hearts Club. He was the CEO of a highly lucrative, illicit digital pornography empire. After a victim washed up, gathered his belongings, and walked out of the basement, believing his secret was safe, Xiao would extract the high-definition video files. He operated a massive, paid subscription service hidden deep within encrypted messaging applications. For a monthly fee of roughly $150 on about $20, thousands of anonymous voyeurs were granted access to Xiao's ever-expanding library of hidden camera hookups. For years, Xiao operated in the shadows, amassing wealth and a staggering collection of stolen intimacy. But the digital world is impossible to contain. The dam finally broke when a paying subscriber decided to rip the videos from the encrypted server and leak them, completely uncensored, onto the open internet. A victim stumbled across his own face on a public forum. The horror of the realization drove him straight to the local police precinct. But the match had already been thrown into the gasoline. Overnight, the bizarre, terrifying visage of Sister Home, now mockingly rebranded by the internet as the Reed Uncle, ignited across Weibo. The clips garnered hundreds of millions of views in a matter of hours. The internet did what the internet does best. It stripped away the humanity of the victims and turned a massive criminal violation into a viral circus. Wild rumors spread like wildfire, with claims that Xiao had successfully filmed 1691 different men. The number was chanted so frequently, it morphed into absolute fact in the public consciousness. Brands shamefully capitalized on the hysteria, slipping references to the Red Uncle into corporate marketing campaigns. The tragedy was mutated into memes, crude parodies, and a torrent of vicious, homophobic vitriol. The authorities scrambled, issuing desperate public warnings, threatening severe legal consequences for anyone caught distributing the uncensored footage or attempting to publicly identify the men in the videos. But you cannot put the smoke back into the fire. The damage was apocalyptic. Vigilante internet sleuths compiled massive, high-definition collages of the victims' faces, blasting them across social media networks, actively encouraging wives and daughters to scrutinize the grids to see if they recognize their husbands or fathers. The internet ruthlessly categorized and mocked the victims. They identified a man they dubbed Mr. For seasons, a tragic figure who would return to the windowless basement for separate times over the course of a single year. Another victim, Leather Jacket Man, was successfully identified by his own social circle. The explicit video was mercilessly forwarded directly to his fiancée. She took to social media to publicly, unhumiliating lie announce the termination of their 3-year engagement. A prominent TikTok influencer, boasting over 1 million followers, was spotted in the leaked cache. In an instant, his carefully cultivated digital empire collapsed, his comment sections flooded with relentless mockery. Perhaps the most tragic figure to emerge from the digital wreckage was a local kindergarten teacher. The internet cruelly dubbed him Mr. May as well. According to the leaked audio, upon realizing the deception in the apartment, the teacher briefly confronted Xiao, before tragically sighing and muttering, "I'm already here." May as well. The fallout was catastrophic. Men were fired from their careers. Marriages disintegrated overnight. The psychological toll of having your deepest, most private vulnerabilities broadcast to hundreds of millions of mocking strangers drove many into total isolation. But the devastation was not merely social. It was biological. Medical reports eventually leaked indicating that at least 3 of Zhao's victims had tested positive for HIV following the exposure of the scandal. While it remains legally unclear if Xiao was the point of transmission, the local health authorities were forced to issue a terrifying, blanket public health mandate. They desperately urged any man who had engaged in intimate contact with the suspect to immediately seek aggressive medical screening. The mandate carried a horrific secondary warning. If the men had remained silent, terrified of the social stigma, they were now putting their unsuspecting wives and girlfriends at lethal risk. The victims were trapped between the terror of public exposure and the moral imperative to protect their loved ones. Xiao was dragged from his apartment in handcuffs, officially detained on charges of disseminating obscene content for profit. The investigation remains open, and the potential for a cascade of further, severe criminal charges hangs heavy over his head. The relentless churn of the internet cycle has already begun to move on. The memes have faded. The viral hashtags have been replaced. The digital mob has found a new target to consume. But for the hundreds of men who carried a watermelon down into that windowless basement, seeking a moment of human connection, the nightmare will never truly end. Their faces, their vulnerabilities, and their darkest secrets are permanently etched into the digital bedrock of the internet, waiting in the dark to be discovered all over again. Thank you for walking through the dark with me tonight, listeners. As you log off, as you lock your screens and retreat into your homes, remember this: the monsters of the modern age do not always hide in the woods. They do not always carry knives. Sometimes they are sitting quietly behind a keyboard, smiling at a webcam, pressing record. Stay vigilant, guard your privacy, and above all, be careful who you trust in the dark. Good night.